Our next speaker is Gordon Laxer, who, as I indicated before, is the founding director of the Parkland Institute at the University of Alberta and author of a recent book that's just come out called After the Sands: Energy and Ecological Security for Canadians. And his talk will be about getting off Canada's carbon energy roller coaster. And he's going to outline his plan of energy security for Canada, which involves phasing out Alberta's tar sands and all carbon exports. So, Gord, it's all yours.
Well, it's great to be here. Thank you for inviting me. I'm learning a lot on this panel. It's a great panel. Well, when I was 22, I hitchhiked through Europe, and I had a Canadian flag attached to my backpack. The Vietnam War was on, and I didn't want to be taken for an American. Well, when Stephen Harper was elected in 2006, I tore the Canadian flag off my backpack and tried to pass incognito. My country stood for most things that I and the rest of the world abhorred. And one of the most egregious was Ottawa's obstructionist tactics on behalf of big oil at international climate action meetings. 192 countries signed the Kyoto Accord on climate change. Canada was the only one to formally pull out. And Canada was regularly pinned with the Fossil of the Year award by international environmentalists. I cringed. The Harper and Alberta Conservative governments and big oil said, well, Canada's emissions are negligible. We only emit 2% of the world's greenhouse gases, and less than 10% of that is from the oil sands. So that if we curb them, it's inconsequential. It was a pathetic argument. Canada has 0.5% of the world's people. We emit 4 times our fair share of emissions. What gives us the right to foul humanity's common atmosphere more than others? Alberta's sands, and I don't call them either oil sands or tar sands, they have a major role, and they're the greatest roadblock to Canada taking substantial action on climate. They're Canada's fastest growing source of greenhouse gases. If the sands ramp up like big, mainly foreign oil in 10, they will emit 102 million tons a year. That's 17% of Canada's 1990 emissions, the benchmark year of the Kyoto Commitment. Well, in 2008 and 2011, the House of Commons passed the Climate Action Accountability Act. It was the Jack Layton Act. And it said that Canada will reduce its emissions by 80% by 2050. And it was, in fact, the first elected house in the world to legislate emission cuts by that much. Europe and the U.S. soon endorsed that target. But of course, Mr. Harper used his conservative, a majority of unelected senators to defeat the act. But it's a noble goal, and to achieve it, Alberta must cap the sands, and then they must be phased out over 15 years. That's what I'm proposing. Michael Levy was the author of a report by the New York-based Council on Foreign Relations. He explained the impossibility of rising sands production with falling carbon emissions. And I quote, "Imagine that oil sands emissions rose as expected over the next few decades and then stabilize in 2030, while total U.S. and Canadian emissions drop by 80% by 2050. Well, the oil sands emissions then will represent all emissions from Canada." So Canada, to do that, Canada would have to shut down all other uses of oil, like driving to work, just so that Alberta sands can reach whatever output big oil wishes. Another way, and other speakers have talked about this, another way to show the incredible effect of the sands and other carbon fuel production in Alberta is this. Alberta has 4.2 million people, and it produces more greenhouse gases, just by a little, than Ontario and Quebec combined. Ontario and Quebec have 22 million people, and Alberta has 4.2 million, and they produce more greenhouse gases. That's 5 times as much per capita, and it isn't from Albertans driving more cars on any scale. So the sands are the elephant in the room, yet neither the Chrétien Liberal nor Harper governments did anything about them. Will the Trudeau and Notley governments have the fortitude to phase out the sands? Well, they won't unless citizens' movements continually push them hard, and push them so hard that they more than counteract the power and influence of big oil. Instead of exporting sands, oil, and other carbon fuels, Canada should focus on energy self-sufficiency as we transition to a low-carbon future run on renewables. We actually produce in this country about the same amount of conventional non-fracked oil as Canadians consume. So what I'm proposing is we actually import 90% of the oil that comes to Quebec is imported oil, 80% that Atlantic Canadians use. I'm proposing that we take the slowly falling amount of Canadian conventional non-fracked oil, supply all Canadians with that. It will give Canadians energy security in the East, and then we can seriously cut emissions. Canadians can't be convinced to seriously conserve if they don't see a direct link between their actions and their country's emissions. Unfortunately, we are in NAFTA, and the proportionality rule, which really only applies to Canada, what it says is that Canada must continue to export the same percentage of its energy as it has in the last 3 years. That's 70% of our oil and over 50% of our natural gas. So that if Canadians conserve, big oil is going to try and export whatever we save. And so then if they did that to the U.S., then our obligation under NAFTA would only grow. Well, in the eyes of environmentalists and foreign governments, Canada is one of the worst eco-culprits. It's partly deserved and partly not. The deserved part is that Canada's high level of carbon use, 6th in the world per capita, almost a third less than Americans and 21% more than Britain's. The undeserved part is that all the carbon embedded in Canadian energy exports for consumption elsewhere, mainly the U.S., is attributed to Canada. If Canada phases out carbon energy exports, our country's emissions will plummet, and Canadians would then see that their actions are actually reducing emissions. You may have seen the proposal by the Alberta NDP and many trade unionists and the Federal Green Party all support the upgrading and refining domestic oil, including that from the sands, before exporting. Now, I used to do this. I used to support this. We should upgrade our resources before we export. Well, it's not a good idea. If successful, it would create a community of workers who are dependent upon the continuation of sands production. And it would take decades of oil production to pay off the capital costs of building those refineries and upgraders. How could you then turn around and say, oh, we're going to phase out the sands now that you've just created these jobs and spent all this money and you've got all these workers you've put in place now? So that is not a good idea. I'm not all that popular in some of those circles in Alberta and the trade union movement and NDP for saying that, but that has to be said. Conservation is a much better way to create jobs. A unit of carbon energy saved produces more jobs than a unit of energy dug up, burned, and emitted. Retrofit all buildings with high insulation across Canada, create district heating, build high-speed intercity rail, LRT and subways, sidewalks in the suburbs, separate cycling lanes. And those jobs will be much closer to home. They'll be all across the country, rather than workers having to fly into Fort McMurray and then fly out. Now is the time to get off the carbon train. More than 35,000 workers have been laid off in the energy industry in Alberta in the past year. Why try to produce another carbon fuel boom? And if the governments actually succeed in getting pipelines to coasts, that could happen. But it would only be followed by another carbon bust, carbon fuel bust, and we have to get off carbon fuel. So we should take this opportunity to transition Alberta and Canada to a low-carbon society. And here are a few ideas. Well, carbon taxes and cap and trade are good ideas, but they're not nearly sufficient to bring about the scale of emissions reductions that we need. A carbon tax high enough to curb the waste of the well-to-do and the rich will be way too high for lower-income people to cope. In a carbon-constrained future, there will be less energy, and if markets determine who gets the lower supplies, the rich and the military will likely corner the supplies. A much fairer and more effective way is through personal tradable energy permits or quotas. This idea was developed in Britain and it was actually passed into legislation in 2008, but not implemented, unfortunately. It would ensure that everyone reduced their carbon energy use a little each year so that no one, however rich, has the right to foul humanity's common atmosphere more than anyone else. It will also help guarantee that lower income people have enough energy to cover their basic needs, like heating their homes and getting to work. Other ideas, of course, we've got to ramp up renewable energy sources, and under the plan that I just talked about, there will be no restrictions on people's use of renewable energy. So it will incentivize people to get on to renewable energy. We should replace all oil imports with domestic conventional to give Eastern Canadians oil security. Phase out carbon energy exports, oil, natural gas, coal, and then use the non-frac conventional oil to shift Canada as a transition to a low-carbon future. We should end natural gas exports to preserve supplies for future Canadian winters. We only have, in terms of proven reserves, only about 10 years. We're running low, yet insanely, in British Columbia, big energy corporations are planning to export lots to LNG plants on the BC coast. In Alberta, 20% of the natural gas produced is used to produce sands oil, to separate the bitumen from the tons of soil. It's really reverse alchemy. It's like turning gold into lead. And of course, it's mainly for export. And Canada's and the NAFTA's proportionality rule, we should have the same exemption that Mexico has. They didn't agree to it. Phase out the sands. If sands producers cannot produce oil the same lower carbon footprint as non-frac conventional oil, phase them out over 15 years, with those that have paid off the capital cost phased out first. Phase out Canada's electricity exports. Instead, the hydro-rich provinces, British Columbia, Manitoba, Quebec, and Newfoundland, should supply the hydro-poor provinces, and then those provinces can shut down their coal and natural gas-fired electrical plants and greatly lower Canada's carbon emissions. Bring in a just transition program of support for energy and construction workers in the sands and other carbon energy projects, and help them move to other useful work, especially in renewable energy and conservation. And negotiate with natives as sovereign peoples and respect their stewardship over their traditional lands. If we do all of these things, with Harper gone, I will no longer hide being Canadian when abroad. If Canada goes from being environmental laggard to a leader, I will happily sew a Canadian flag back on my rucksack. In the post-carbon era, we can dream big again.